So you like America Trends podcast, eh? Well, John, I just imagine that because if they're still here and listening to one of our podcasts, I would believe that perhaps the person listening has listened before.
I would assume so too, given our numbers. So I think we got a good thing going here.
Well, we've got hundreds of thousands of people who have tried us and come back for more or visited our social media availabilities on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and the like. And we are really grateful, aren't we, John?
Oh, yes, we are. We love doing this, and I love the fact that we got people listening. I mean, it's really exciting.
And they are reacting and retweeting, and they're making certain to be engaged in the content that we have. And you know, John, we try to mount the tallest hill and be the reconnaissance team looking out for what's just ahead so we can warn people, look out, danger ahead, about your job, about your economic security, whatever it may be, social and political trends in our country. And I think we really hit on something, John.
Oh, I think we hit on some really good topics. And if you're just listening to this or just hearing this, go back and listen to some of our episodes because there's a lot of great information and we get a lot of great people to explain what's going on in the future that we should be looking at.
Exactly. And we're not pigeonholed into the left, right, center thing. We really give you a lot of diverse opinions on this podcast. And we've been doing this since the mid-2017 period. And here we are in 2019. And the one thing that we're missing, John, and I don't know, we've got to do something about it. We want some sponsorship because we've had the opportunity to utilize a studio, you and I providing our time, all the guests providing their time, but it would be great if we could enlist a sponsor in this podcast.
Yeah, so please email us. Come on.
Yes, if you'd like to be a sponsor, maybe you've been listening for a long time, you really like the way we do it, our personalized, chatty approach, the serious way that we interview. If you really would like to be part of this, and John and I can do a really fun message for you, but you've got to let us know that you're interested, and then we'll talk to you about the packages that we can customize for you. So write to me, Larry Rifkin, at lrifkinr@gmail.com. lrifkinr@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, that would be great.
What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to America Trends. Larry Rifkin and John Krofsik. John, in government, we trust.
Oh, so you think?
No, well, unfortunately, no. And it's pretty discouraging.
It is.
When you think about the steady decline in trust in America's governing institutions. But then again, John, when you think about it, we've lost confidence in a lot of institutions.
We sure have. We've lost confidence in our doctors to some extent, and our courts, you look at some of the court cases come down and you got to scratch your head and say, what the heck is going on?
Religious institutions.
Right.
How about the banks back in 2008 when they imploded?
Should have gone to jail.
Yeah, exactly. So we've lost trust in a lot of institutions, and that's not a good thing. Now, I think it's really interesting that Donald Kettl, who's going to be joining us, a political scientist from the University of Texas, and he's got a book called Can Governments Earn Our Trust? And this is not just one of these hypothetical questions, because if they don't, I don't know how our society really stays together when we're so loosely hung together today and we're so fractured in many ways, unless we believe in something that we give so much of our resource to, that we depend upon for so many services. If we don't trust them, what's the outcome ultimately.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I don't know. That's why, but what gets me is they're not doing anything. They don't, the alarm bells aren't going off for them. That I think they like is business as usual, because if we don't know what they're doing, you know, then they can do a lot.
But that may be the parties, that may be some of the partisans, but the people who work in government, let's think about that last government shutdown. And there were people who I saw who said, I love going to work every day. I work in this department, I work inspecting food, I do this for the public, and I really believe in my job.
Well, you're right. Those are the pawns. The trouble is the people on top are trying to pull the wool over our eyes, I believe, and it's a game they
So
play.
we all get caught up in
Right,
it. Their
right.
employees, we as consumers of government, because we do consume a lot of their products. And what's really interesting, John, is when you break it down on a macro or micro level, in many cases, and right now, for example, I'm on Social Security and Medicare.
Right.
I am.
Yeah.
Believe it or not, I'm
That's hard to believe.
of that age, John. Help me up, please. But the point is that I really trust that I'm going to get the check on time, that they are going to send me the premiums that I have to pay, that I'm going to be covered. And I have not been let down by that.
Right.
Most
I
people.
think hey, and you look at the post office. I mean, they're very reliable. There's a lot of people out there working for the government that are reliable, but you got those people who are on top there who are not reliable.
Well, they're gumming up the works for all of us.
And they're not doing their jobs. That's what really makes me mad. I mean, we got a Congress and a Senate who have, given up the ship to whoever.
Well, let's think about it. I mean, I think Don Kettl will share with us, and you and I have talked about it for a long time, that a lot of these private, parochial, self-centered, self-aggrandizing interests that can influence what goes on in the halls of Congress, their voices speak much more loudly than ours. And they've got to re-earn our trust. So we'll talk about all of that with Don Kettl here on America Trends. On the line with us is Donald Kettl, a professor at the University of Texas in Austin, and he's also the author of Can Governments Earn Our Trust? And, Professor, we have lost trust in virtually all institutions, banks, churches, schools in many cases. Is that any different from the faith that we've lost in government?
In so many ways, the lack of trust in government and our problem with our institutions are wrapped up with each other, and it's one of the great tragedies of the last generation in particular. There was a time not too long ago, back in the Eisenhower and Kennedy and the beginning of the Johnson administrations, where trust in government was actually pretty high, and where citizens, for the most part, trusted government to do the right thing most of the time for themselves. But then a series of things happened as the wheels gradually began to come off. There was the problem with Vietnam, Watergate, increasing sense that government itself is becoming increasingly ungovernable. And then if you look at some of the academic research, too, there's also the underbelly of the story, which is rising income inequality as well. So you put all this together, and what we have is a story where there's a sense that government's not only not working very well, but we don't trust that it will ever be able to work well again on top of that. And the public opinion polls make for pretty depressing reading.
Oh, I know. I want to get to that, but I want to ask, is it fair to say that the level of government closest to us, the politician we see on the street, somebody that we know in our town, does a better job in our minds than the larger central governments in your assessment?
Yeah, that's precisely what all the evidence shows, and there are two interesting pieces to that. The first is there really is the sense that what we can see, what we can touch, what we can feel is what it is that we trust. We look at our member of Congress, which in general we like better than Congress in general. We look at the level of government closest to us, local governments, and even state governments, which we trust much more than the federal government. So in general, the closer the government is and the more our relationship with it, the more that we trust what it is that it does. And that gets to the second point, which really gets to what is, in all of what's a kind of pretty depressing story, a piece of good news, which is that the more we can establish that connection between citizens and government, the more that we can try to establish a relationship between us as citizens and what government does for us, the more we tend to trust that it works. And so the more we can work on strengthening that, we ultimately can have the way out. And that's why when I wrote the book, Can Governments Turn on Trust, it ultimately is a book with a happy ending. But the happy ending really requires us to focus on strengthening those relationships and those connections that really matter most to us.
Well, I think a lot of what you're saying is about political voice, that we feel ours at the federal level, for example, is being drowned out by these larger, better financed interests, money, and the explosion of interest groups. And you say, as more interests have become better organized, they have gained more control over government decisions. Therefore, government tends to reflect their preferences, not the preferences of the citizens as a whole.
That's right. And it's a combination of things here. There's not only the fact that we have these powerful interests that have become increasingly well organized, especially in Washington, that increasingly are not only shaping in ideas, but shaping debates, shaping policy in ways that are in many ways off-putting to people everywhere else. If you want to have just one side of this, how big and important this is, Washington's become a pretty good restaurant town. And you can actually get a lot of good meals in Washington. I guarantee it's not because there are a lot more federal employees, because there aren't, or the federal employees are being better paid because they're not. It's because there's so many more lobbyists go around and generating an entire industry that keeps an entire industry of restaurants going in a way that was just never the case before. And so you see that as part of what's happening, and you see the sense that citizens getting the sense of being disconnected from government because they don't feel that they have that voice, and they also they worry that these interests, these special interests, have a voice that they just simply can't have themselves. Some of this is perception because of the distance, but some of it, quite frankly, is reality because these interests are extraordinarily powerful in setting the agenda, in framing big debates, in putting out policy ideas, in being there when none of the rest of us can be at those crucial moments to push ideas through the door. It has to do both with what happens in Congress, but also in the regulatory arena as well. And you put all that together, what we have is a system where too many Americans simply feel that they're just being frozen out of a politics in Washington that seems increasingly distant, increasingly inaccessible, and unfortunately increasingly unresponsive.
Well, you know, the old saying, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And you trace back
that's right.
our loss of innocence, perhaps, to Vietnam. And let me take you to a reform that a lot of people said, wow, this would never be done. It took so many years to get it even passed in the way that it did. But I'm going back to Obamacare in 2009, 2010. And pharma got to keep its benefit, which was that the Medicare program would not try to negotiate rates. The government would not. Health insurance companies got theirs because they were going to enroll all these new healthy people. Ben Nelson got his Cornhusker kickback. And Joe Lieberman, a senator from Connecticut, and you spent a lot of time at Yale in Connecticut, no public option. So is this an example of where people look at something that is meant, quote unquote, to benefit us, and yet really it's been a difficult program to sell to the American public and to hold on to?
It's been difficult. It's been difficult in so many ways, in part because we never really, as a country, wanted to embrace a simple issue of saying we're going to have government pay for health care for everybody. And Obamacare, of course, is not health care for everybody. It's health insurance for everybody, which is different. Once you start and cross that line, then you get into a program with extraordinary complexity, and where inevitably you have insurance companies, you have healthcare providers, you have a whole collection of other interests who know much more about this than any of us ever do, making the decisions that in fact shape the rest of us. Like all of us, I get these pieces of mail periodically from my health insurance company with an explanation of benefits that explain what it is that I got in terms of care and who's paying for what, and I can never make any sense out of them. I save them as souvenirs, but I'm not sure what I would do if I ever wanted to actually contest that, because I can't understand what it is that they're telling me. So if you take that and play it out on a far larger scale, having to do with a health insurance program for all of us, it becomes so complex that most of us can't possibly understand, so complex that the people who do understand have a wildly disproportionate voice in how that all works, which means that the special interests really shape the way in which the program came together. So that explains in part how the program happened. But then we have two other pieces that are really important. The first is as we started to implement it, we had a situation where the increases in health insurance premiums varied wildly depending on where it is that you end up living. There was a far greater increase, for example, in Wilmington, Delaware, than in Philadelphia, even though they're only 30 miles apart. And the question is, what could possibly explain that? Because the people in Wilmington are certainly not sicker than the people who are just 25 to 30 miles away in Philadelphia. It has to do with the complexities of the state insurance systems and the way in which healthcare providers bill and lots of other things that most of us mere mortals could never possibly understand. But the result is we have increases in premiums that just vary wildly in ways that are impossible to really explain in a straightforward way to citizens. Add to that one other thing, which is then the Republicans came in and said, this is just an overreach by government. We're going to repeal and replace Obamacare. The one thing that they discovered that they couldn't do was to repeal and replace it. So then the question is, well, now what are we going to do? We can't repeal, we can't replace, we can't get agreement on anything. But then they began slowly pulling on the threads that were part of the fabric of Obamacare with some of the regulatory changes that they pushed through. And as a result of that, what we have is a program now that is one that nobody really likes. The Democrats didn't get the kind of universal coverage that they wanted. The Republicans didn't get repeal and replace that they wanted. We have a program that's continuing to limp along on the back of regulations that even most of the people involved really don't understand well. And so what we have is this jury-rigged system that's the product of these battles that special interests have shaped, which most of us don't understand, which affect all of us, but which in the end, a lot of us feel relatively powerless to control. And in a system like that, quite frankly, it really does feel like a system that is very hard for anybody to trust, because it's very hard for most of us to understand what it is that's actually happening.
And we were told at the time that this was going to be the first major piece of legislation that was not bipartisan in nature, that ultimately when we looked at Medicare, when we looked at some of these other big programs from the 1960s and even Social Security, that you needed that buy-in. And today, of course, the problem solvers, the centrists, have been swept away in a tidal wave of polarization. Where does that place the issue of trust when you've got everybody gathered around the edges and not in the middle?
And what it really means is that the more we push people to the sides, the more that we make policy from the sides. It means that if you're not on the winning side, that you're not going to trust what the other side does, because there's a sense that, well, here's an idea that just got rammed down our throats. On the other side, if you win, there's this constant nagging worry that, well, we won now, but we better fight hard to find a way to stay in control, because if we don't, the other side is going to come in and push all of our hard work away. That's really the story of Obamacare in a nutshell, and it makes it even harder to trust the results and even worse to trust the process that produces the results. Of course, there's nothing new in this kind of conflict. If you go back to the very beginning of the country and the question about what to do about slavery, what to do about the power between the northern and the southern states, what to do about mercantilism on the one side and agriculture on the other, we've been fighting these issues since we've had a country, and even since before we had a country. And so conflict over what to do and about the process of trying to reconcile different competing aims is something that we've been dealing with for a long time. But what's happening increasingly is not only the fact that we have these disputes, which in a sense we've always had, but we've had increasing polarization where there's a sense that my side has got to win, and if your side is not one that we can deal with, that we're not going to deal with it, and we don't trust it, and we're going to try to ram our decisions down the other side's throats. And it really makes the entire prospect of governing from the middle something that increasingly is becoming difficult. I hope not impossible, but increasingly becoming difficult. And all this, the more that we look at and stage these issues at the national level, framed in terms of polarization, and framed in terms of the difficulty of finding compromise, and framed in terms of governing from the extremes, the harder it is for any of us to trust the process and the system, to feel that we have a voice, and to really have the kind of confidence in our democratic systems that was what the founders at the beginning really hoped that the system was going to be able to create for us. So we shouldn't make any mistake by assuming it was ever a golden age where these problems didn't exist. But on the other hand, it's impossible to escape the sense that these problems are serious and in many ways getting worse.
Donald Kettl is with us, a professor at the University of Texas, author of Can Governments Earn Our Trust? Now, all that we've been talking about really does predate Donald Trump, but there is this phenomenon of populism and nationalism, which he embodies and his election embodies. So when we're now fighting even about basic fact, and we don't know that we can trust the government to tell us, for example, what's really going on the border. Is it really a crisis or an emergency? What does that do to erode trust?
What it really does, in part, is to just reinforce all the things we've been talking about. In the book, Can Governments Earn Our Trust?, the real focus of what I've been talking about is to look at the historical roots of a lot of these things. But what we have now is the long tradition of the problem of building trust, which has happened as long as people have been dealing with each other on the one side, which now has taken on this awful twist where there's a sense that you really can't trust much of anybody on the other side. And one of the things that the rise of populism has done is to deepen the divisions between the people on different sides, to have a sense that there is a clear division between us, that there's no possibility of compromise, that the key is keeping my folks together, pitting them against the folks on the other side, and hoping I can get enough people on my side to be able to win and to be able to continue to be able to suggest that that's what really matters.
But that sounds more like feudalism than a democratic republic.
And that's one of the reasons why we tried to create a democratic republic, because we didn't think that was in general going to be a good thing. The real genius of the founding fathers, and the genius of the musical Hamilton, in fact, why people get $2,000 a seat for going to see that, is that there was a triumph in the American Republic against the idea that we're going to just pit North against South, large cities against smaller ones, large states against the smaller ones, against the people who were involved in shipping against farmers, that we could find in the middle of all those differences core values that would tie us together. And the magic of the American Republic has been this enduring belief that we can find this middle. But the problem now is that if we have leadership that says what we're going to do is we're going to lead by separating our people against everybody else, we're going to create a series of facts that reinforce that the people on my side believe those facts, the people on the other don't, that in fact we don't have facts that are facts anymore, that are universal things that everybody can believe. We not only make it more difficult to find compromise, we make it more difficult to try to find a middle. We make it more difficult even to agree on what the questions are and what the basic points of fact are in which we can get the answer.
I know, and that seems...
And that's a dangerous point to be.
Exactly. What role does income inequality play in all of this?
There's a sleeper piece behind all this. There's this ugly side of the kind of populism that we've talked about. But along with that, one of the things that's happened as distrust in the United States has grown is that income inequality has grown as well. And political scientists have looked at some of these questions, and there are a lot of political scientists who argue that at the root of inequality is this sense that some people win, some people lose, that inequality in turn tends to drive a lack of trust. And so the interesting question here is, to what degree do we really, are we looking at really some of the wrong kinds of things? That yes, this populism is dangerous. Yes, the fact that Congress can't get anything done is dangerous. But part of the reason is that they're dealing with questions that are rooted in inequality that make it very hard to get the answers that we're looking for. One of the things that in the United States and elsewhere that's the case is that the more that income inequality has risen, the more that distrust in government has risen. And that's something that's happened not only in the United States, but in other countries as well. And there's a especially pernicious piece of this in the United States that connects with all of what we've been talking about. If you're a middle-income American, there really is increasingly a sense that, you know what, I'm out there, I'm working hard, In a lot of cases, I and my spouse are working hard. We don't seem to be getting ahead. And in fact, in the last generation, the family income of people in middle America, after you account for inflation, has not grown at all. And so I'm out there, I'm playing the game, I'm going by the rules, but the rules are not working for me. The people at the top seem to be doing just fine, thank you, and their income is growing. People at the bottom have government programs to look out for them. I'm working hard in the middle, I'm paying my taxes. We're both working hard in our family, but we're not getting ahead. And so it's hard to trust the system where it seems if you play by the rules, you don't actually see your situation improving. And so underlying all this, one of the reasons why these forces of populism are so strong, one of the reasons why the institutions are broken, is that they're trying to solve what are very deep, very fundamental problems that have to do with growing differences among us that we don't talk much about, but which really lie right at the core. A core part of what it is that fuels the current process of populism is the sense that I'm playing by the rules, but the rules just aren't working for me. And so I don't trust what it is that's happening. There are other people making those rules. They're winning, and I'm not. And Trump's great genius was tapping into that and tapping into that underlying not only anxiety, but fear on the part of so many Americans that the system just wasn't working. And so if we really want to understand, it's not only the fact that Congress doesn't work and that the federal government seems distant and that special interests have taken control, but a large part of it is that they are dealing with fundamental questions that many Americans don't seem to feel that they're winning on. And to put things differently, my guess is that Congress would work a whole lot better if it had easier questions to deal with. So understanding just how complex and difficult those problems are is an important part of trying to explain why it is that Congress so often seems to struggle so much to try to get its work done.
So recessions and global warming and poverty, they're all quite difficult. And then we throw up our hands because we have differing ways of looking at how we should solve these problems and government's role in it. I do want to ask you, though, you also talk about the dichotomy between what you call wholesale trust in government versus retail trust. Can you give us a brief description of that?
Sure, because I think this is the positive way out, because much of what we've been talking about in terms of income inequality, in terms of populism, in terms of the deep divisions of the country, in terms of the sense that our institutions don't look very well, in terms of the power of special interest groups, a pretty depressing story, quite frankly. And I told my editor when I started down the road to write this book, Can Governments Earn Our Trust?, that I wasn't going to write the book unless I was sure at the end that the answer was going to be yes. I just didn't want to write a depressing book because there's plenty of depressing news around already. But the basic answer, I think, is yes, governments can earn our trust. Most of what we've been talking about here has to do with things at the broad level, at what I call the wholesale level of government politics. But on the other hand, it's not surprising because Americans have always pretty much distrusted government, and there always have been these deep underlying concerns. But the basic fact of what it is that constitutes trust is something like this. You and I deal with each other, and you expect me to do something, I do it. I do it again another time. I do it, and when I do it, you appreciate it and pay for it. We develop a relationship of trust between us where you expect me to do something, I expect you to do something. I do it, you do it. We trust each other to keep doing it. And that's the basis at the retail level that really helps to define and strengthen trust. When it comes to government, it turns out that just as we know that most people don't like Congress, but like their member of Congress themselves, that most people maybe don't like government, but if right now a fire breaks out across the street from where I'm sitting, I'm going to trust that the fire department is suddenly going to arrive. They're going to arrive fast, but they're going to do a good job because at the retail level, I trust the nature of the relationship between me and the government that delivers that. I trust that for the most part, the highways are going to work pretty well and the potholes are going to be filled. And to the degree to which I can trust that basic relationship, then it means that there's a possibility of building trust. And what's happened in lots of interesting places is that government officials, especially government leaders, have said, I'm going to establish a relationship with citizens where I'm going to make sure that they know that when I go to work, I'm going to work for them. I'm going to provide services and care that are what they expect. I'm going to do it in a way that's respectful of them and what they are paying for. I'm going to do it in a way that delivers good services, in a way that's consistent and effective. And in doing that, I'm going to earn their trust every day when I go to work. And you see some of this in the private sector. You see it, fortunately, even in government. The people
Well, I
who,
think
for
people
example,
who
run
are on Social Security or Medicare generally have a favorable outlook as to those programs and how well they're administered and their checks there on time and the like. So I think that concept is a really interesting one, the way you present it. Well, in closing, I just want to ask you, Don Kettl, because you said you didn't want to write a book that was negative, and yet you write, no issue is more important or more discouraging than the steady decline of trust in America's governing institutions. And I don't want to be like an old country song, how do we get trust back when it's gone? Which is not a bad title, actually. But is there something else the government can do to earn their way back into our hearts?
Well, and the thing I think has to do with this. So we could let's have our fun, watch our talk shows, engage in our Facebook posts and our tweets back and forth, and understand all that. Maybe begin to get civil with each other again, which would be a nice thing. But what can we do? Government needs to engage its own employees so that they feel they've got a piece of the action themselves in the way their agencies work. The people who go to work in the agencies need to understand who it is that they're working for. They need to work for citizens and produce services in a way that are reliable and that serve citizens well. And there's a lot of evidence that shows that you can do it, and that if you do it, citizens recognize it. When they recognize it, they appreciate it, and that maybe it's not a big thing, but in small ways, step by step, that they can move the needle. And when they move the needle, trust improves. So this is not a problem we can solve with some magic sweep at the broad wholesale level, but it's one that bit by bit, day by day, piece of action by piece of action, we can in fact make progress on at the retail level. And that's something that I've seen happen, where I'm very hopeful, and where the process of rebuilding trust in America, I think, has to begin.
And we had other authors on from the Brookings Institution reminding us that a lot of the policy action and a lot of the real on-the-ground action is happening in states and localities, in cooperation, higher education, healthcare facilities, and local government. So maybe that's where we begin to rebuild interest and belief in our democratic system. Thank you so much, Don Kettl, for being with us today. The book, again, Can Governments Earn Our Trust? It's been a pleasure to have you on America Trends.
It's been so great having a chance to be able to talk with you about these really important issues. Thanks so much.
Hey, Larry.
Yeah, what's up,
I
John?
got some exciting news for you.
Well, let's hear it.
We're part of the MHNR network.
And where can we find that?
That's mhnrnetwork.com.
I'm going there right now.
All right.